The team had been preparing for this expedition for months. They were experts in their fields, geologists, environmental scientists, and survival specialists, and they knew the risks of venturing into such a remote area. Still, nothing could have prepared them for what was about to happen. The region they had entered was wild and untouched, full of dense forests, winding rivers, and mountains that seemed to scrape the sky. On paper, it looked beautiful and serene. In reality, it was unpredictable and dangerous. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. They set up their base camp near a small river, used GPS to mark their location, and began their fieldwork. Each morning, they woke to the sound of birds singing, and each evening the sun painted the sky with shades of orange and pink. It was easy to feel a false sense of safety, but then the weather started changing. It began with small signs, thick clouds rolling in earlier than usual, the wind shifting suddenly, and a strange stillness in the forest. At first they thought it was normal seasonal change, something they could handle. They were experts after all. Yet that afternoon the first major storm hit. Rain poured in sheets, thunder shook the trees, and lightning cut the sky like a silver knife. Their base camp, built to withstand normal weather, struggled under the heavy storm. Tents collapsed, supplies were scattered, and communication devices failed one by one. They tried to send a distress signal immediately. Using a satellite phone, they called for help. They sent emails, texts, and even a long SOS message into the sky. "We need rescue," they wrote. "Our location is dangerous. Please respond." But hours passed without an answer, then days. The lack of response started to take a mental toll. They had been trained to handle emergencies, but nothing could fully prepare someone for the feeling of being completely alone in the middle of the wilderness. Nights were the hardest. The wind howled through the trees. Strange noises echoed in the darkness, and the isolation felt crushing. Each rustle of leaves or snap of a branch made their hearts race. They couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching them. They began rationing food and water carefully. The river provided drinking water, but it needed boiling to be safe. The storm had ruined some of their food supplies, and they had to stretch every bite. Sleep was scarce because one of them was always on watch, listening for danger, hoping for a sign of rescue. Then, something strange started to happen. It began with subtle hints, footprints that did not belong to humans, large and deep in the mud, appearing near their camp, but never threatening them directly. They saw shadows moving through the forest at night, too big for any ordinary animal they knew. At first they assumed they were just imagining things, a trick of fear and exhaustion, but the signs became impossible to ignore. Something was there, and it was paying attention to them. One morning, after yet another sleepless night, one of them decided to follow a set of tracks. They led toward the river, but instead of danger, they found something remarkable. There was a small area of cleared vegetation, a place where wild animals had created a safe path to the water. It was almost as if the forest itself was guiding them. At first they were hesitant, unsure whether following these signs was wise, but desperation outweighed fear. They carefully traced the path, step by step, and discovered that it led to fresh water, uncontaminated and flowing freely. It was exactly what they needed to survive. The realization that something was helping them was both frightening and comforting. They could not explain it, but they felt that the forest and the creatures in it were responding to their presence in some way. Each day brought new signs, birds circling overhead to warn them of approaching storms, large mammals moving nearby without aggression, and smaller animals leaving trails that guided them safely through difficult terrain. They began to notice patterns. The footprints seemed to appear at critical times, as if marking danger zones to avoid. The birds' calls changed depending on the situation, alerting them to storms or unstable ground. Even the wind seemed to carry messages in a strange, rhythmic way, guiding them when they were uncertain which direction to take. As days turned into a week, the team started to rely on these signals more than they relied on their equipment. Their human-made devices had failed, but nature itself seemed to be filling the role. The storm had forced them into a new kind of awareness, a heightened sense of observation and connection with the environment around them. It was exhausting, but it was also awe-inspiring. At night they sat together listening to the sounds of the forest. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals, and the flowing river became a language of survival. They began to speak about the signs openly, sharing interpretations and theories, and a sense of unity grew stronger among them. In those quiet, tense moments, they felt less like victims and more like participants in a larger story. The forest was no longer just a threat, it was a guide, a silent guardian watching over them. Despite the growing sense of awe, fear never completely left them. Every decision mattered. Every misstep could be dangerous. They had to remain alert at all times. But now, instead of feeling helpless, they were learning to navigate the wilderness with guidance they could not fully explain. They were discovering that survival was not just about skill or equipment. It was also about paying attention, listening, and trusting instincts, both their own and the signs from the world around them. The turning point came one afternoon when they spotted a massive bear near the river. Their first reaction was panic. They had been taught to respect bears and keep a safe distance. But something was different. The bear did not charge or growl. It paused, looked at them with steady eyes, and then moved in a way that almost seemed to direct them toward a safe crossing of the river. They followed cautiously, hearts pounding, and discovered a shallow area where the current was calm. It was a path they might not have found alone. That encounter changed everything. It proved that the signs they had been seeing were not random. The forest was responding to them. The wildlife around them was not hostile but protective. They were not alone. Their calls for help had not reached humans, but somehow in the vastness of the wilderness, they had reached Earth itself. As night fell, they huddled together and reflected on their experience. Fear was still present, but it had transformed into respect, awe, and cautious hope. They realized that survival was no longer a matter of waiting for someone else to come. They were active participants in a delicate balance with nature. Every choice they made, every path they followed, was part of a silent dialogue with the creatures around them. By the end of the first part of their ordeal, the team had learned something crucial. When humans fail to answer cries for help, the world around them might respond in ways they cannot fully understand. It was a lesson in humility, patience, and the unexpected forms of support that life can provide. The forest had become their guardian, the animals their silent allies, and the wilderness no longer just a challenge to survive, but a force guiding them toward life. The first part of their journey ended not with rescue, but with understanding. A fragile but growing trust between humans and the wild creatures who had quietly answered their cries. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew that they were not entirely alone, and that hope could come from the most unexpected places. After the first week of survival, the team began noticing things they could not easily explain. The footprints, the signals from birds, and the careful paths left by animals were becoming more frequent. At first, they thought it might be coincidence, but it became increasingly clear that the wildlife around them was watching, guiding, and even protecting them. It was as if the forest itself had awakened in response to their desperate cries for help. The mornings became a mixture of cautious optimism and constant vigilance. Every time they moved, they paid close attention to the subtle signs around them, the tilt of a branch, the sudden silence of birds, or the appearance of tracks that seemed to appear overnight. They began to rely on these hints more than their equipment, which had mostly failed during the storms. Even compasses seemed unreliable after heavy rain, but the movements of the animals gave them direction, almost like a silent map carved into the landscape. One day, while walking through dense underbrush, one of the team members spotted a series of footprints unlike anything they had seen before. The prints were large but not human, and they seemed to avoid areas that were dangerous, like loose soil near the riverbank or a steep slope. Curiosity overpowered fear, and they decided to follow the track slowly, watching for any sudden movements. After some distance, the footprints led them to a small clearing. There they discovered a group of deer grazing safely, completely calm in their presence. The team realized that the deer had guided them to a safe area where they could rest without fear of predators. It was a shocking revelation. Animals that normally ran from humans were now showing signs of trust, and in turn, the humans had to learn patience and respect. They stayed in the clearing for a while, watching how the animals moved, trying to understand the patterns. The experience was humbling. It reminded them that survival was not just about their own skills or technology, but about understanding and cooperating with the natural world. As the days passed, other encounters reinforced this strange partnership. Wolves appeared at the edges of their camp at night, keeping watch. Their presence was intimidating, but the wolves never attacked. Instead, they moved in ways that seemed to form a protective circle around the scientists' temporary shelter. Birds became messengers, flying ahead and alerting the team to changes in the weather or the arrival of other creatures. Even small animals like squirrels and rabbits played a role, leaving signs that pointed the humans away from danger. The team began to communicate differently, not just with each other, but with the forest itself. They learned to read the cues, understanding that every movement and sound could hold meaning. They started to move more quietly, respecting the environment around them. Each step was taken with care, each decision weighed carefully. Because the forest had become more than a backdrop, it had become an active participant in their survival. Food became a critical concern, as the storm had destroyed much of their supplies. But the animals helped in subtle ways. One morning, a fox appeared near the edge of the forest, watching the team carefully. It seemed to guide them toward a thicket where wild berries grew. Later, a herd of deer revealed a hidden path to a stream rich with fish. Slowly, the humans began to understand that they were not alone in sourcing food and water. The forest provided if they paid attention. Sleep was still a challenge. Nights were long and dark, and the team always felt the tension of being exposed to unknown dangers. But the protective presence of the wolves and other animals allowed them to rest more safely than they could have alone. They learned to sense when the animals were alerting them to danger, and when they were calm, it was safe to relax for a few hours. In this way, survival became a shared effort, a strange yet comforting partnership between humans and wildlife. The team's interactions with the forest started to change them emotionally as well. Fear remained, but it was now mixed with a sense of wonder. They had begun to see patterns and connections they had never noticed before. Each encounter with the animals was not just survival, it was a lesson in patience, awareness, and respect. They realized that the forest, often seen as harsh and indifferent, had a silent intelligence and instinctive wisdom they could rely on. One afternoon, they faced a particularly dangerous situation. Heavy rain had caused the river to swell, making their usual crossing impossible. The team hesitated, unsure how to proceed. But then a large bear appeared near the water. It did not charge or threaten them. Instead, it moved along the bank, sniffing and watching, then settled near a shallow section where rocks created a natural bridge. Understanding the bear's guidance, the team carefully crossed, supporting each other and following the bear's lead. It was a tense moment, but it worked perfectly. The forest had saved them again, teaching them that trust and observation could be more powerful than brute force or planning. As the days turned into weeks, the team noticed that the creatures seemed to anticipate dangers even before the humans did. Birds would suddenly fly off, signaling incoming storms. Wolves would change positions when other predators approached. Even the rustling of leaves seemed to form messages, patterns that took time to interpret. Every day was a test of awareness, focus, and patience. But the team was learning quickly. Survival was no longer just a personal challenge. It was a collaboration with nature itself. The psychological effects of this constant interaction were profound. Initially, the team had been tense, anxious, and fearful, but slowly they developed a sense of trust. They learned to observe without interfering, to listen without judgment, and to act only when necessary. They started keeping quiet logs of the animals' movements and behaviors, trying to predict future actions. The forest became a teacher, and they were eager students, discovering lessons that no classroom could ever provide. One of the most remarkable changes came in how the team viewed danger. Before, every rustle of leaves or distant howl caused panic. Now they started to interpret signals. If a deer moved quickly through the underbrush, it meant something was approaching. If a wolf growled softly, it meant caution, not immediate threat. They were no longer reactive. They were learning to anticipate and understand. The forest had taught them a form of intelligence they had never experienced, silent, instinctive, and life-saving. They also began to form emotional bonds with some of the animals. They observed a pair of wolves that frequently patrolled near their camp, always keeping a respectful distance but never leaving their post. They watched a mother deer carefully guiding her fawn near the same water source. Even small birds became familiar, recognizable by their unique calls. These connections were subtle, but they reminded the team that survival was not just about food, water, and shelter. It was also about relationships, trust, and respect across species. By the end of part 2, the team had changed profoundly. They were still desperate for human rescue, but they were no longer helpless. They had learned to navigate the wilderness with guidance they could not fully explain. They had discovered that help could come from unexpected places, and that survival was as much about observation, respect, and cooperation as it was about skill or equipment. In the quiet evenings, as they sat around small, safe fires, they reflected on what they had experienced. Fear and awe mingled in their hearts. They had cried for help to the stars and heard nothing, but the earth itself had responded. The animals of the forest had become their guides, protectors, and teachers. They were no longer simply humans in a hostile environment. They were part of a complex, interconnected system that had, in its own way, answered their desperate cries. The story of part 2 ended with cautious hope. The team knew the road ahead would remain dangerous. Storms could return, rivers could rise, and predators could still pose threats. But they also knew that the forest had chosen to respond to them, guiding them through perils and offering protection when they needed it most. The human spirit, combined with the instinctive intelligence of the wild, had created a lifeline. They had learned to survive not alone, but with the help of Earth's creatures. A lesson in humility, trust, and the unexpected ways life can support those in need. By the time the team reached the 3rd week in the wilderness, their understanding of the forest and its creatures had grown in ways they could never have imagined. The strange protective signs they had been observing now felt like a silent conversation. Every movement of the animals, every sound in the trees, and every pattern in the underbrush carried meaning. They were no longer just humans trying to survive. They were participants in a living system that seemed aware of their presence. The mornings began with careful observation. Birds would circle above the treetops, and the team learned to watch their flight paths. Sometimes a sudden swarm of crows indicated danger ahead. Other times, the soft chirping of smaller birds led them toward areas rich with food. Wolves continued to patrol near their camp at night, and the team noticed that their movements were not random. The wolves positioned themselves in such a way that they formed a protective barrier against any approaching predators. Even at a distance, the humans could sense their watchfulness. One day, while exploring a steep hillside to gather samples for their research, they encountered a massive bear near the edge of a cliff. The bear's size alone was intimidating, but what truly surprised them was its behavior. The bear did not charge. Instead, it paced back and forth, then turned its head toward a safe path down the hill. The team froze for a moment, unsure if they should trust the animal. But instinct and prior experience with the forest told them that the bear was guiding them, not threatening them. Carefully, they followed the path indicated, descending the hill without incident. Every step made their hearts pound, but they felt an incredible sense of awe at the silent intelligence of the creature. That evening, around a small campfire, the team discussed what had just happened. They realized that this was no longer a series of coincidences. The animals were actively influencing their survival. Wolves, bears, birds, and even smaller creatures like squirrels seemed to understand their presence and respond accordingly. The team had cried for help into the vastness of the world, and the earth itself had sent a response. It was a lesson in humility and patience, and the team was beginning to understand that survival required more than just human skill. It required observation, respect, and cooperation. Food remained a daily challenge. They had learned to gather berries, nuts, and edible plants, but the forest provided in unexpected ways. One afternoon, a fox appeared near their camp, quietly watching them. The team followed as the fox led them to a cluster of wild mushrooms that were safe to eat. Later, a deer led them to a hidden stream where fish were abundant. The forest seemed to reward patience and attentiveness. Every encounter with wildlife became an opportunity to learn, survive, and adapt. Water, too, remained a precious resource. Some days the river swelled dangerously after heavy rains, making crossings treacherous. The team relied on the guidance of animals once again. A large elk appeared at one particularly dangerous crossing, walking ahead to test the current. Once the path was confirmed safe, the team followed carefully, crossing without injury. These moments were tense but reinforced a growing trust between humans and the creatures around them. Despite the guidance, fear remained constant. The forest was beautiful, but it was also harsh and unpredictable. Thunderstorms could appear without warning. Rivers could rise, and predators still roamed the land. Every sound in the night, a distant roar, the crack of a branch, kept them alert. Yet alongside fear grew a growing sense of wonder. They were witnessing intelligence, instinct, and cooperation on a scale that felt almost magical. Survival was no longer just a personal challenge. It was a shared effort with the creatures of the wild. The team also learned to interpret subtle signs of warning. Birds flying in unusual patterns indicated storms or danger. Wolves changing their positions or vocalizations signaled predators nearby. Even the rustling of leaves could carry meaning. Slowly, the humans began to anticipate events, responding with calculated caution rather than panic. They were learning a new form of communication, one that did not rely on words but on observation and understanding. One particularly intense encounter occurred during a heavy rainfall. Visibility was low, the ground was slippery, and the river was swollen. As the team tried to navigate a path along the riverbank, they heard a low growl. Panic threatened to take over, but they stopped and observed. A pack of wolves emerged from the trees, moving in formation. At first, the team froze, fearing aggression. But the wolves did not attack. They positioned themselves between the humans and a hidden predator, a large mountain cat that had been stalking the area. The humans realized that they were being protected, and slowly they continued along the path under the silent watch of the wolves. The moment was unforgettable, a clear demonstration that the forest was responding to their presence in precise and purposeful ways. Food, water, and safety were no longer the only concerns. Emotional endurance became equally important. Isolation had initially created stress and tension, but the team had learned to rely on each other and on the silent guidance of the forest. They found small joys in observing animal behavior, in discovering hidden streams, or in finding edible plants. These moments of wonder helped maintain morale and strengthen their determination to survive. They began documenting their observations meticulously. Every track, sound, and movement was recorded. They noted how birds signaled storms, how wolves formed protective perimeters, and how bears indicated safe paths through dangerous terrain. Each entry became a guide not only for their survival, but for understanding a complex system they had never fully appreciated. It was a mixture of science and intuition, observation and instinct, a partnership with life itself. The team also noticed that some animals seemed to anticipate human behavior. They observed a group of deer near a food source that moved to allow the humans access. Wolves seemed to understand when the humans were exhausted and shifted their positions to create safe spaces for rest. Even smaller animals like birds and rodents avoided danger zones that humans might otherwise stumble into. It became increasingly clear that the forest had its own logic, and the humans were slowly learning to navigate it. By the end of Part 3, the team had reached a level of awareness they had never experienced. The forest was no longer just a place to survive. It was a living, responsive ecosystem that had become their guide. Fear and caution remained, but they were balanced by respect, awe, and a growing sense of partnership. The animals were no longer random observers. They were active participants in the team's survival, answering cries that humans could not respond to. As night fell, the team gathered around a small fire, reflecting on the day's events. They realized that each encounter with the animals was teaching them lessons far beyond survival. Patience, observation, humility, and respect were becoming ingrained in their behavior. They were learning to live in harmony with the forest, understanding that help could come from the most unexpected sources. The story of Part 3 closed with cautious optimism. The humans were still trapped in a harsh, unpredictable wilderness, but they were no longer helpless. They had discovered allies in the forest, creatures that watched, guided, and protected them. Every day was still a challenge, but the lessons they were learning and the trust they were forming with the animals were giving them hope. The wild had answered their cries for help in ways no human could, proving that survival sometimes depends on understanding the instincts and intelligence of the natural world. By the fourth week, the team had grown accustomed to reading the signs of the forest, understanding the patterns in the movements of its creatures, and learning to anticipate dangers. What had begun as fear and confusion was slowly turning into something remarkable, a form of communication with the wilderness itself. Every step they took, every glance toward the treetops or riverbank, became part of a dialogue with the animals that surrounded them. It started with small gestures. Birds would land nearby, chirping softly, and the team learned to recognize the different meanings in each call. A sudden flurry of wings often indicated that something larger was approaching, whether a predator or a storm. Wolves shifted their positions at night, forming protective arcs around the sleeping humans, while deer sometimes appeared in the early morning to show safe paths through thick underbrush. These patterns became their map, their guidance system in a world where technology had failed them. Food and water remained a constant challenge, but the team had begun to understand that the forest provided for those who observed it carefully. One morning, a fox appeared, sitting quietly at the edge of the camp. Instead of retreating, the team followed it at a safe distance. The fox led them to a grove filled with edible roots and berries. Later, when water became scarce due to a sudden dry spell, they noticed that birds were flying in a specific pattern over the trees. Following the path, they discovered a hidden stream running through a thicket, clear and cool. Each encounter reinforced the understanding that the animals were actively guiding them, leading them to resources critical for survival. The psychological impact of these interactions was profound. In the early days, fear had dominated every decision. Now a mix of awe, respect, and cautious trust filled their hearts. They were still humans in a dangerous wilderness, but they were no longer entirely at the mercy of chance. The forest had become a partner in their survival, and the creatures within it were the guides. One afternoon, while attempting to cross a steep ravine, they faced a new level of challenge. The ground was wet and slippery from recent rains, making the descent perilous. The team froze at the edge, unsure how to proceed. Then, from the trees above, a group of deer emerged, moving carefully down the slope. Observing their path, the humans realized that the animals were showing a safe route. Following closely, they navigated the terrain without falling, their trust in the guidance of the forest deepening. It was a silent, mutual understanding, one that required patience, attention, and respect. The nights became more intense. Darkness brought with it the sounds of distant predators, cracking branches, and rustling leaves. Yet the presence of the wolves and other protective animals allowed the team to rest more confidently. They began to notice subtle cues. A wolf shifting its weight could indicate the approach of a predator, while the sudden flight of birds could warn of impending danger. Learning to interpret these signals required full concentration, but it provided a sense of security that no technology could replicate. The team also began experimenting with communication themselves. They moved slowly, avoided sudden gestures, and sometimes left small markers or signs to indicate their intended path. Surprisingly, the animals seemed to notice. Wolves would adjust their positions to guide them, birds would change flight patterns, and even smaller creatures seemed to move in ways that suggested awareness. The forest was no longer a passive environment. It was an interactive partner, responding to their behavior in subtle but meaningful ways. One day, during a particularly tense situation, the team encountered a river swollen with rainwater. Crossing it alone would have been nearly impossible. They hesitated, unsure of where it was safe to step. Then a large bear appeared, moving carefully along the edge. It tested the depth with its paws, then turned to look at the humans, almost as if to say, "This is the way." Trusting the guidance, the team crossed slowly and carefully, holding hands for balance. The experience left them shaken but filled with a deep sense of gratitude. The forest and the creatures within it had saved them once again. Food and water were not the only ways the animals helped. The team began to notice signs that suggested awareness of their emotional state. Wolves often lingered near the humans when tension was high, their presence offering comfort. Birds would perch nearby during moments of despair or confusion, as if providing silent companionship. Even small animals such as squirrels or rabbits seemed to behave in ways that indicated understanding and caution, avoiding paths the humans might take during dangerous moments. This emotional connection was unexpected but deeply impactful. As days passed, the team started to predict the behavior of the forest and its creatures more accurately. They learned that certain birds always appeared before storms, that wolves could indicate safe resting spots, and that large mammals often moved to open areas when danger approached. They were becoming fluent in a language without words, a code of observation and instinct that required complete attention. Survival was no longer a passive act. It was an active engagement with the living world around them. The team also discovered moments of profound wonder. One morning, as fog rose from the river, they saw a family of deer leading a small herd of fawns along a narrow path. The animals moved with precision and care, ensuring that the humans could follow safely. Later, a pair of wolves emerged, pacing in a protective pattern that created a corridor of safety. These moments were breathtaking, a reminder that the forest operated with a wisdom that humans could barely comprehend. Despite the growing harmony with the wilderness, danger was never far away. Predators still roamed, weather could change suddenly, and the terrain remained unforgiving. Every step required vigilance, patience, and careful observation. Yet even in danger, the team had learned that they were not alone. The animals were not merely passive observers. They were active participants, responding to their presence and guiding them toward survival. By the end of Part 4, the team had achieved something extraordinary. They had moved beyond fear and confusion to a state of active partnership with the forest. They could interpret signals, follow guidance, and anticipate dangers in ways that seemed almost instinctive. The animals were not just helping, they were teaching. The forest had become a living, responsive ally, answering the calls for help that humans could not reach. As night fell, the team gathered around a small fire, reflecting on the lessons of the day. They realized that survival was no longer simply a matter of skill or equipment. It was about awareness, observation, respect, and trust. The forest had provided food, water, protection, and guidance. It had responded to their cries in a way that no human or machine could. Every encounter was a lesson in humility, patience, and cooperation. The story of Part 4 ended on a note of cautious hope. The humans were still deep in a challenging wilderness, but they were no longer helpless. They had learned to navigate the world with the guidance of creatures far wiser in instinct and awareness than themselves. The forest had become a partner. The animals, their silent guides, and survival a collaborative effort that relied on understanding and respect. The team knew that challenges still lay ahead, but for the first time they felt truly equipped to face them, not alone, but with the living world as their ally. By the 5th week, the team had grown deeply attuned to the rhythms of the wilderness. Every sound, movement, and scent carried meaning. They had learned to anticipate storms, recognize danger, and find food and water with the help of the forest and its creatures. What had begun as sheer fear had transformed into a cautious confidence, fueled by trust in their animal allies. One morning, the team faced a new challenge. A sudden storm had flooded parts of the forest, making their usual paths impassable. They had to find an alternative route to reach higher ground, where they could wait out the rain safely. At first, panic threatened to take over. The ground was slippery, the river nearby was swelling, and visibility was low. But then a large wolf appeared, pacing near the edge of the flooded path. Its movements were deliberate, testing the ground and signaling the safest way forward. The team watched carefully, understanding that following this guidance could save their lives. Slowly, they moved through the forest, one careful step at a time, following the wolf and observing its behavior. Birds flew ahead, seemingly scouting the area and alerting them to hazards. Even smaller animals like squirrels and rabbits moved with purpose, showing safe spots to step and areas to avoid. Every step required complete attention, but the team had grown confident in reading the signs around them. Food and water remained constant concerns. While the forest had provided in many ways, the team still had to forage carefully. One afternoon, a fox appeared near a rocky outcrop, sitting quietly and watching. The team followed it to a hidden patch of wild berries and edible plants. Later, they noticed that birds were leading them toward a shallow stream where fish were abundant. It was a subtle but clear message. The forest provided, but only for those who paid attention. Each day reinforced the importance of observation, patience, and trust. Nighttime brought new challenges. The sounds of distant predators, the rustling of leaves, and the howls of wolves created tension, even for a team now experienced in the wilderness. Yet the wolves' presence offered protection. They positioned themselves strategically, forming natural barriers around the camp. Their silent vigilance allowed the humans to sleep more safely, knowing that danger was being monitored even while they rested. As the days passed, the team realized that the forest had begun to respond not just to their presence but to their needs. When they were exhausted, animals seemed to guide them toward safe resting spots. When food was scarce, creatures led them to resources they might have missed. And when storms approached, birds and other animals gave subtle warnings that allowed the team to prepare in time. The relationship had become a partnership, built on instinct, observation, and mutual awareness. One of the most intense moments came when the team had to cross a steep, rocky ravine after heavy rain. The path was slippery, the river below roared with force, and a single misstep could be fatal. The humans froze, unsure how to proceed. Then a large bear appeared, moving deliberately along the safer sections of the rocks. It tested each step before advancing, signaling to the humans the safest route across. Slowly and carefully they followed, each step taken with extreme caution. By the time they reached the other side, their hearts were racing, but they were alive and profoundly grateful. The forest taught them more than survival skills. It taught them emotional endurance. Weeks of isolation and constant danger had taken a mental toll, but the presence of the animals offered comfort and reassurance. Wolves in particular seemed to sense moments of fear or despair, lingering nearby and watching without aggression. Birds and smaller creatures also played subtle roles, their movements often guiding the team away from hidden hazards or toward safer areas. These interactions were small, but they reminded the humans that they were not alone. Food scarcity was another constant challenge, but the team had learned to trust the forest's guidance. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, a fox appeared, leading them to a patch of wild mushrooms. Later, a deer showed them a hidden water source. The team began to realize that survival depended not only on their own skills, but also on observing and understanding the instincts of the creatures around them. Every day became a test of awareness, patience, and trust. The team also became adept at interpreting subtle warnings from the animals. Birds taking flight often indicated storms or approaching predators. Wolves changing positions or vocalizing softly suggested caution. Even the rustle of leaves or the movement of small creatures could provide critical information about unseen dangers. Learning this silent language required constant attention, but it provided a sense of security and a deeper understanding of the forest's rhythms. As they navigated the wilderness, they began to notice patterns in how the animals guided them. Wolves would patrol specific areas, ensuring that the humans were protected during sleep. Deer and other herbivores often appeared near food sources, allowing the team to access resources safely. Birds scouted paths ahead, signaling obstacles or hazards. Even small animals like rabbits or squirrels seemed to move in ways that highlighted safe routes. The team learned that every action in the forest carried meaning, and that survival required complete observation and understanding. One particularly dangerous night, a storm caused the river to overflow near their camp. The team had to move quickly to avoid being trapped. Lightning flashed, thunder roared, and rain poured down in sheets. Wolves emerged from the trees, guiding the humans toward higher ground. Birds flew overhead, signaling hazards along the way. Even small animals seemed to point the humans toward safer paths. Step by step, they navigated the flooded forest, relying entirely on the guidance of the animals. It was tense and exhausting, but they survived, realizing once again that the forest was actively responding to their presence. The team's reliance on the animals deepened their appreciation for the wilderness. Every encounter, every sign, and every successful navigation through danger reinforced the idea that survival was a shared effort. The forest and its creatures were not just passive elements, they were active participants, guiding, protecting, and teaching. The humans had cried for help into the void, and the earth itself had answered. By the end of Part 5, the team had achieved a profound understanding of survival. They could navigate the wilderness, find food and water, anticipate storms, and avoid dangers, all with the help of the animals around them. The forest had become a living ally, responding to their needs and providing guidance in ways that no human or technology could. Fear and caution remained, but they were balanced by respect, trust, and a growing sense of partnership with the natural world. The story of Part 5 closed on a note of cautious triumph. The humans were still deep in the wilderness, facing constant challenges, but they were no longer helpless. They had formed a bond with the animals, relying on their instincts, patterns, and guidance. Every day was a struggle, but it was also a lesson in humility, patience, and cooperation. The forest had answered their cries for help in the most unexpected way, proving that survival sometimes depends on understanding and trusting the intelligence of the natural world. By the 6th week, the team had survived more than they ever imagined possible. Each day had brought new challenges: storms, swollen rivers, steep cliffs, and dangerous predators, but they had endured. Not through sheer luck or technology, but because of the incredible silent partnership they had formed with the forest and its creatures. What had begun as fear and desperation had become a deep understanding of life in the wild, and an appreciation for the instincts and intelligence of animals that humans often overlooked. The first sign of hope came unexpectedly. One morning, while the team was navigating a dense section of forest, they spotted the faint glow of sunlight reflecting off something in the distance. It was not the rising sun. It was the search and rescue helicopter that had been sent after the delayed satellite distress signals. At first, disbelief and excitement overwhelmed them. After weeks of uncertainty, they realized that help had finally arrived. Yet even as they prepared to leave the forest, they were hesitant to move too quickly. The terrain was dangerous, and they had learned to read the signs of the wilderness carefully. Birds flew ahead, wolves shifted their positions, and even deer paused in their movements as if observing the humans' intentions. The team followed the natural guidance they had relied upon for weeks, moving cautiously but confidently toward the clearing where the rescue helicopter could land safely. The arrival of the human rescuers was both joyous and surreal. Faces filled with relief and concern greeted them, and the team finally felt the comfort of being in human hands again. But as they looked back at the forest, the trees and the animals that had guided and protected them, a profound feeling of gratitude and awe filled their hearts. These creatures had been their silent guardians, answering cries that humans could not hear, protecting them when danger loomed, and guiding them toward safety in ways that no training or technology could replicate. During the extraction, the team reflected on everything they had experienced. Weeks of isolation had been physically and emotionally exhausting, but they had discovered something extraordinary. The forest and its creatures were not just part of the scenery, they had been active participants in survival. Wolves, bears, birds, deer, and even the smallest animals had demonstrated awareness, instinct, and intelligence that had kept the team alive. Every step, every decision had been guided by a partnership that went beyond human understanding. Once back in safety, the team shared their story with the rescuers. At first, it was hard to believe. Tales of wolves forming protective barriers, bears guiding humans across dangerous terrain, and birds signaling storms sounded almost unbelievable. But the rescuers could see the exhaustion, the awe, and the subtle emotional changes in the team members. The humans were different now. They had been changed by an experience that went far beyond mere survival. In the days that followed, the team documented their journey in detail. Every encounter with wildlife, every sign and signal was carefully recorded. They wanted to ensure that the story of what had happened was preserved, not just as a tale of survival, but as a lesson about observation, respect, and cooperation with the natural world. They realized that humans often underestimate the intelligence and awareness of animals, assuming that they are purely instinct-driven, but their experience had proven otherwise. The creatures of the forest had responded with purpose, timing, and awareness. The psychological impact of the ordeal remained significant. Initially, the team had been anxious, fearful, and uncertain. Weeks of isolation, constant danger, and reliance on instincts had tested every limit. But the presence of the animals had provided comfort, guidance, and reassurance. Wolves in particular had become silent companions, their watchfulness allowing the humans to rest without fear. Birds had offered warnings, and even smaller animals had helped avoid danger. This invisible support network had been life-saving in ways that humans rarely consider. The team also reflected on the lessons they had learned. Survival is not only about skill, tools, or technology. It is about awareness, observation, and respect for the living world. The forest had taught them patience, humility, and the importance of paying attention to even the smallest details. They had learned to anticipate dangers by observing animals, to locate food and water through subtle signs, and to navigate treacherous terrain with guidance they could not fully explain. These lessons would stay with them forever. Even after leaving the forest, the experience continued to resonate. Each team member felt a deep connection to the natural world, an understanding that humans are part of a larger system. They had cried for help to the stars and received no response. But Earth itself, through its creatures, had answered in a way that no human or machine could. The partnership with the forest had been instinctive, silent, and powerful, a reminder of the intelligence and awareness present in the natural world. The story of their survival spread slowly but surely. Researchers and scientists were fascinated by the detailed accounts of interactions with wolves, bears, birds, and other wildlife. The team's documentation offered insights into animal behavior, communication, and cooperation in ways that had rarely been observed. Their experiences highlighted the potential for humans to coexist with the natural world, learning from the instincts and intelligence of creatures that often go unnoticed. Emotionally, the team had changed. Fear was still present, as it is in any life-threatening situation, but it was now tempered with respect and awe. They had seen firsthand that survival often requires listening, observing, and trusting forces beyond human understanding. The forest had been a teacher, and the animals had been mentors, providing guidance, protection, and lessons that went far beyond textbooks or training manuals. Looking back, the team realized that every moment in the forest, from finding food and water to navigating dangerous terrain, had been shaped by the silent presence of animals. Wolves had formed protective barriers, bears had guided safe crossings, birds had signaled hazards, and even smaller creatures had offered subtle clues. It was a symphony of instinct, intelligence, and awareness, all responding to human cries for help that technology could not answer. The experience also left a lasting sense of humility. Humans often assume that they are the dominant force in nature, but the team had discovered that intelligence and awareness are not exclusive to humans. The creatures of the forest had responded with purpose, understanding, and timing that had ensured survival. It was a profound reminder that humans are part of a larger ecosystem, one that requires respect, observation, and cooperation to navigate safely. In the final days before leaving the forest entirely, the team spent time reflecting silently. They watched the wolves patrolling near the river, birds flying overhead, and deer moving gracefully through the trees. Each movement carried a story, a lesson, a signal of awareness and protection. They realized that their survival had been a collaborative effort, not just between humans, but with the living world around them. When the helicopter finally lifted them away from the forest, they looked down at the landscape below. It was beautiful, dangerous, and alive in a way that no human-made map or device could ever convey. They had survived because they had learned to observe, to trust, and to cooperate with the creatures that inhabit the earth. Their cries for help had been answered not by humans, but by the silent, instinctive guardians of the forest. Even after returning to civilization, the lessons remained vivid. The team shared their story widely, not for fame, but to highlight the intelligence, awareness, and cooperative behavior of animals. They emphasized that humans often underestimate the natural world, and that survival sometimes depends on listening, observing, and understanding forces beyond our control. The experience had reshaped their view of life, survival, and the relationships between humans and the living world. By the end of Part 6, the story of survival had reached its conclusion. The team was safe, physically exhausted but emotionally transformed. They had experienced fear, uncertainty, and danger, but they had also witnessed extraordinary intelligence, instinct, and cooperation from the creatures around them. Their journey was a testament to resilience, observation, patience, and the unexpected ways the natural world can answer cries for help. The team returned to their daily lives forever changed. They carried with them not just memories but lessons that would guide their understanding of the world. They had learned that survival is not only about strength or skill, but about awareness, respect, and partnership with life itself. In the end, the Earth had answered their cries when humans could not, teaching them lessons that would never be forgotten.